Good evening, and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 6 of Genesis chapter 20, and we're continuing to read from verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night, and said to him, Behold, thou art but a dead man, for the woman which thou hast taken, for she is a man's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her. And he said, Lord, wilt thou slay also a righteous nation? Said he not unto me, She is my sister? And she, even she herself? Said he, is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this. And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart. For I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. Now therefore restore the man his wife, for he is a prophet, and he shall pray for thee, and thou shalt live. And if thou restore her not, know that thou shalt surely die, thou and all that are thine. I'll stop reading there. Now, we've been considering the typology, the figure that God is developing here of Abimelech, king of Gerar, as a type of Satan, And yes, it's a little difficult to see Satan when Abimelech says that he did this in the integrity of his heart and the innocency of his hands. But keep in mind, that's not true of Abimelech either, is it? In actuality, did Abimelech possess integrity in his heart, innocency in his hands? Well, no, because the Bible tells us the heart of man is desperately wicked, deceitful above all things. A deceitful heart, it is certainly possesses no integrity, and man is guilty. He is most guilty of sinning against God, and so there is no innocency of the hands, as the hands represent the will. Man's corrupt. He is most definitely evil when it comes to the inclinations of his will. So even though that's true of the man Abimelech, like it's true of all unsaved people and all people, unless God had mercy and granted salvation. But see, God is referring to a specific situation, and that is concerning Sarah. The Lord is the one who is watching out for her. And it says in verse 6, And God said unto him in a dream, Yea, I know that thou didst this in the integrity of thy heart, for I also withheld thee from sinning against me, therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. And we saw in our last study, and I want to read it again, in 1 John chapter 5, what the Lord says concerning his elect and the threat of Satan. It says in verse 18 of 1 John 5, We know that whosoever is born of God sinneth not, but he that is begotten of God keepeth himself, and that wicked one toucheth him not. Well, the king of Gerar was a wicked man. He was at least that, and in addition, a type and figure of the wicked one, Satan. And he did not touch Sarah because he said he didn't come near her, and God confirms it. He says, Suffered I thee not to touch her. So he never did touch her. Physically, we can understand in this case, historically, but spiritually it points to the fact that Satan could never harm one of God's elect, no matter how desperately he tried to do so, and he did. He tried to have them burned at the stake. He had them, by stirring up wicked men, giving them ideas, throw them to lions, by stirring up the minds of wicked men in this evil generation, this last end-time generation. No matter what they call their evil and their wickedness, it's such a good thing, wonderful thing, that a woman has control of her own body. It's just it's just ugly sin when a baby is taken out of the womb and destroyed in an ugly manner. Everything about it is filthy. It is actual filthiness in the spiritual realm, and it is murder. Everything is wrong with it. And yet, despite the fact that Satan was trying his best, and there's just so many millions and millions of children that were aborted in this vain attempt, a vain pursuit after the elect, just as it was Satan long ago, about 2,000 years ago, when Christ was to be born of the Virgin Mary. What did he put into the mind of that evil man, King Herod, when he heard that a king was going to be born, and he felt threatened? And so he had Herod, Satan is working behind the scenes. We have to understand this, but it's Herod's sin. Herod had the idea, well, we'll kill all the children 2 years old and under, because that's the time he learned from the wise men who came from the east. And so he murdered toddlers and little babies in order to get at the seed of Abraham, singular, who is Christ. And at the time of the end, when God was completing his salvation program, Satan was still at it by having little babies destroyed in the womb. And again, this relentless yet vain, meaning empty, attempt to destroy just one of God's elect. If he could only destroy one, that would mean God failed. God did not do as he said, and who knows what repercussions there would be in that case. If Christ died for the sins of 200 million, let's say, and only 199,999,999 of those elect became saved, and one, just one, was harmed, he was injured, he was destroyed by Satan finally. In all of his efforts to do so, he finally succeeded, let's say. It's an impossibility, let's just say. Well then, that person died, and God has obligated himself to bring salvation to those while they're living. And that person did become saved while they're living, but his sins were paid for, yet he died in his sins, a child of wrath, even as others. You can see the just terrible situation that would bring. It would mean that God was unjust in bringing death to that person, because he had obligated himself to save the soul before the death came, and it didn't happen. Well, that was Satan's hope in going after the people of God, but he had a problem like we all had a problem. We didn't know who they were. We didn't know which ones. So he went out to destroy all, just as the gospel went forth, that all might hear the word of God. We didn't know who the elect were, scattered amongst the people of the nations. So you have to share the gospel with everyone. Likewise, if you're on the other side of the coin, if you're the Antichrist, if you are the one contrary in constant opposition to God's program of salvation, then you have to attempt to destroy everyone. And that's another one of the reasons why the world is so self-destructive. And the world destroys itself with drinking and drugs and crime and murder and abortion and all these things. It's man killing himself because Satan was moving and certainly willing that be done amongst those that were in submission to him to a high degree concerning their subjugation to him through sin and to spiritual captivity of being in his kingdom of darkness. And yet it never succeeded, not one time. Christ protected his people. He would not allow the devil, that wicked one, to touch them. They could not be harmed. The baby, for example, who was aborted after 8 weeks, well, the mother could not abort it at 6 or 7 weeks. God arranged those circumstances because at 6 weeks, the mother had a friend come over and visit and mention a Bible verse. And God used his word to save the baby, although the next week or 2 weeks later, she went to get an abortion. You see, God would not allow the old man to die of a disease until finally came the gospel to him, and he heard, and God quickened his soul, and then he died of his disease. Or the example of the thief on the cross. The thief could not die in his sin as a thief. He could not die being caught in robbing someone, and the man pulls out a sword and runs him through, because he was not yet saved, yet one of God's elect. Therefore, God arranged the circumstances for when he would become saved, which was practically the last hour of his life. That is how God protected his people. Salvation is always the safety net. It is always that which does not allow Satan to touch the eternal condition, the eternal resting place of an individual. And so he could not, like this king could not. Well, again, in verse 6, God is saying something very important doctrinally when he says, I also withheld thee from sinning against me. Therefore suffered I thee not to touch her. God withheld an evil man who has an evil heart, desperately wicked. Remember what we read earlier in Genesis, back in Genesis chapter 6, about the hearts of men. It said in Genesis 6:5, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And, when we read that verse and we read Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is desperately wicked and deceitful above all things. Whatever you can think of, the heart is more wicked. And we read in Matthew, where Christ speaks of that which comes out of the heart, all manner of fornication and lusts and murder and just a long list of sins comes flowing out of the heart. We see this description of the heart of the unregenerate individual, the sinner in his sins, and we shake our head and we just wonder why, as we look back at history, why wasn't the world worse? And even as we look at today's world, why isn't it even much worse now? Despite the fact that today's world is just incredibly much worse than the world of the past. And that's a question too. Why is the world today, why are why is mankind so incredibly more sinful today than in time past? But as we read the Bible, he's not more sinful. He's not. It was only evil continually over 7,000 years ago in the days of Noah, in the days of Jeremiah, 2,700 years ago, or 2,600 and some years ago. Man had a desperately wicked heart. Nothing's changed with man's sinful condition. And you see, this is what the Bible calls the mystery of iniquity. How could the world function to the degree it did? How could people have this basic morality that they displayed throughout much of history? How could this evil king, Abimelech, be held back? Or how could he say, in the integrity of my heart and innocency of my hands have I done this? That is, in not touching Sarah. And God agrees with him. You see, even though God withheld him, still God credits him for not sinning against him in that way. And all these things are very curious. They're mysterious. And yet the Bible does present answers. It does explain to us how this can be, why the world was, even though always evil, yet able to function again with mankind who are in their sins, showing some basic level of morality and human kindness. Just look back at some of the history we have of 50, 70 years ago, and it's like a different world. People were respectful, they spoke respectful, they dressed respectfully. You go back 50 years, practically all the women wore dresses and all the men wore suits. And yet they were desperately wicked then as well as today. But today, we don't see the respectfulness. The language is just awful. The ideas of man are just horrible today, and we see it all over the place with television, movies, music, everything. The multiplication of sin, which means the multiplication of the sinfulness coming forth out of the heart of man, has just developed and grown to such a proportion that has never been in the history of the world. And yet, has man's sinful heart been multiplying sin? Actually, no. The same evil heart, whose imagination has always been evil, whose thoughts have continually been evil in the days of Noah, it's the same today. But something's changed. And the change is in the area of God's restraint, where God withheld Abimelech from sinning against him, so too did God withhold many unsaved people in many ways from sinning against him throughout the history of the world until we reach the time of the end. And at the time of the end, that hand of restraint is being lifted, and really we're just seeing the true condition of man's heart become evident all around us. It's what has actually been there all along. Well, Lord willing, when we get together in our next Bible study, we're going to look at this idea a little bit more closely of God restraining sin in the hearts of men, and the lifting of that restraint in our time as really an indicator that we are at the end of the world.